The air is thick with the scent of blood and burning wood. The walls of a captured city smoulder under the night sky, bodies of the fallen strewn across the dirt like discarded relics of a forgotten war. The acrid smoke mingles with the metallic tang of blood, creating a suffocating atmosphere that clings to the lungs and stings the eyes. A knight stands in the center of it all, his sword slick with crimson, his armor dented from the chaos of battle. His breath is slow, measured. Around him, his men loot the dead, their chants of victory mixing with the distant wailing of the survivors. He does not flinch. He does not weep. He believes he has done God's will. This is Tancred of Hauteville, a man forged in fire and conquest. A name whispered with both reverence and fear. Born around 1075 in southern Italy, Tancred was the grandson of the formidable Norman conqueror, Robert Guiscard. His lineage was steeped in a tradition of warfare and ambition. But what drove men like him to war? Was it faith? Was it ambition? Or was there something far darker lurking inside their minds? The world stands on the brink of a holy war. The year is 1096, and the First Crusade has begun. Across Europe, men are leaving behind their homes, their families, their very identities, all for a cause greater than themselves. Or so they believe. The Pope has promised eternal salvation to those who take up the sword in the name of Christ. Kings and lords speak of glory, riches, and divine justice. But the truth, it was something far more complex. For some, this war was about faith. For others, it was about power, vengeance, and survival. And then there were men like Tancred of Hauteville, a warrior who did not fight for a kingdom or a crown. He fought for something far more personal. A bastard-born Norman, raised in the brutal warrior culture of southern Italy. Tancred had no throne to inherit, no noble title to pass down. But war could change that. War could make a man into a legend. Before the Crusades, Tancred's life had been one of endless training, conflict, and survival. The Normans, originally Viking raiders, had settled in Italy generations earlier, turning from seafaring pillagers to hardened warriors. They fought not for honor, but for dominance. Their world was built on violence, ambition, and conquest. From the time he could walk, Tancred's education was war. As a child, he would have learned to wield a sword before he could properly write his name, because in his world, reading didn't save lives. Steel did. He would have been trained to ride a war horse not for sport, but for killing. By adolescence, he had seen men die in battle, watched cities burn, and understood that power was taken, not given. Unlike the noble-born knights of France or Germany, Tancred was not given a title. He had to take one. By the late 11th century, Europe was a land of rivalries, blood feuds, and shifting alliances. Christianity had splintered between East and West, and the Byzantine Empire, once the unchallenged ruler of the Eastern Mediterranean, was in crisis. The Seljuk Turks had swept into Anatolia, defeating the Byzantines at the Battle of Manzikert in 1071, a catastrophic loss that shattered Byzantine control over its eastern territories. Meanwhile, Pope Gregory VII and the Holy Roman Emperor Henry IV were locked in the investiture controversy, a brutal conflict over whether kings or the church had the authority to appoint bishops. Across Europe, noble families feuded, landless knights roamed in search of plunder, and Christian lords sought to expand their power. The stage was set for war, but it was a Byzantine plea for aid that would ignite the Crusades. Byzantium, once the crown jewel of Christendom, was on the brink of collapse. The once great empire had suffered decades of defeats. its legions reduced to scattered remnants. The rise of the Seljuk Turks had devastated Byzantine holdings in Asia Minor, reducing an empire that once controlled the eastern Mediterranean to a state of near ruin. In 1195, the Byzantine Emperor Alexios I Komnenos made a desperate move. He called upon the Latin West for help. He expected mercenaries, hardened knights who would fight for gold. What he got was something far greater, a holy war. In November 1095, Pope Urban II stood before a vast crowd in Clermont, France. What began as a call for reinforcements for Byzantium transformed into something far greater, a Christian war of vengeance. Urban described Christians suffering under the rule of infidels, churches burned, women violated, men slaughtered. He painted a picture of horror, whether true or exaggerated, and then made a promise that would change history. Whoever goes on this journey, not out of greed, but purely for the sake of Christ, shall have all his sins forgiven. For men who had spent their lives killing, looting, and sinning, this was a chance at redemption. The crusade would be an apocalypse, not a pilgrimage. Nobles saw an opportunity to seize new lands. Knights saw a chance to carve out glory. Peasants, desperate and starving, saw salvation. Across Europe, men abandoned their homes, leaving behind wives, children, and lands to march into the unknown. The First Crusade had begun, and for Tancred, this was not just a call to faith, it was a call to power. Tancred joined his uncle, Bohemond of Taranto, one of the most ambitious Norman commanders. Together, they led an army of seasoned warriors, men who had fought against the Byzantines, Muslims, and even other Normans. These were not men of blind faith, they were men of war and conquest. In the winter of 1096, as the Crusaders assembled, the greatest journey of Tancred's life began. He would leave behind the battlefields of Italy and sail toward the Holy Land. He did not yet know the horrors that awaited him, the starvation, the betrayals, the dark truths that would test his soul. As the first wave of Crusaders assembled, Europe trembled with anticipation. The first to march were not hardened knights, but peasants led by the fanatical preacher, Peter the Hermit. This people's crusade ended in disaster. Lacking discipline, the untrained mobs pillaged Christian lands before being annihilated by the Turks near Nicaea. When Tancred and the true knights arrived months later, they found their corpses rotting in the fields. Tancred's first major test came at Nicaea. The city was well fortified, surrounded by thick walls and a deep lake that allowed supplies to flow in. Tancred led relentless night raids, setting fire to gates and cutting down Turkish scouts. But as the Crusaders prepared to storm the city, they were betrayed. Byzantine forces had secretly negotiated with the Turks, entering the city without them. Tancred and his men were furious. They had fought and bled for a victory that had been handed to the Byzantines. Despite this betrayal, Tancred pressed on. The Crusaders marched into Anatolia, enduring blistering heat, starvation, and disease. Horses collapsed from exhaustion, their carcasses rotting in the sun. Some men drank the blood of their fallen animals to survive. As they reached Tarsus, Tancred stormed the city and seized it, only for Baldwin of Bologna to arrive and force him out days later. It was an insult Tancred would never forget. The war was just beginning. Ahead of him lay Antioch, the siege that would define the crusade. The road to Antioch, starvation, betrayal, and the breaking of men. The Crusaders pushed deeper into Anatolia, where the land itself became as much an enemy as the Turks. Blistering heat, disease, and thirst stalked them like vultures. Entire companies of men collapsed from exhaustion. Some deserted in the night, while others simply laid down in the dust and never rose again. Water became more valuable than gold. Those who found wells were often met with blades rather than gratitude. The strongest drank, the weakest died. Tancred and his Normans endured, hardened by years of warfare in Sicily and southern Italy. Unlike the softer knights from France and Germany, they had known suffering before. They had fought in the unforgiving Mediterranean heat, waged war on both Christian and Muslim foes, and learned to survive where others perished. This was a war of faith, but faith did not fill a man's stomach. Only conquest did. When the Crusaders reached Antioch, it loomed over them like an unbreakable fortress. Its massive stone walls, fortified by over 400 towers, made it one of the most powerful cities in the East. It had been held by the Byzantines, then the Turks, and now it was the next great prize of the Crusade. But the Crusaders lacked siege equipment, food, and time. The walls seemed impenetrable, and the only way forward was a siege that could last months, perhaps even years. As the siege dragged on, hunger became the true enemy. The Crusaders ate rats, dogs, and the leather from their boots. Some even resorted to cannibalism, digging up the corpses of fallen comrades and roasting them over makeshift fires. The Turkish defenders inside the city had food and supplies, mocking the starving soldiers beyond the walls. Tancred, however, refused to break. His men kept discipline, launching skirmishes to harass the defenders, always looking for weaknesses. Then they found one, a traitor. A disgruntled Armenian guard named Firuz had been bribed by Bohemond. One night, under the cover of darkness, Firuz opened a small gate in the walls, allowing a vanguard of knights, including Tancred's men, to slip inside. In a single night, Antioch fell. What followed was a massacre. Crusaders stormed the streets, cutting down every Turk they found, men, women, and children alike. Blood flowed in rivers. Those who sought refuge in mosques were slaughtered where they knelt in prayer. No mercy was given. But then, the Crusaders learned the true horror. The day after taking the city, a vast Turkish army under Kerboga of Mosul arrived, surrounding Antioch. The Crusaders had become the besieged. Starvation, disease, desperation. Some knights fled the city in the night, abandoning their comrades. Tancred, Bohemond, and the other commanders knew that if they did not act, they would all die within the walls they had just conquered. Then, a monk named Peter Bartholomew claimed to have found the Holy Lance, the very spear that had pierced Christ's side. Many doubted him, including Tancred. But men on the verge of death will believe anything. With nothing left to lose, Crusaders marched out of the gates to face an army that outnumbered them 3-1. And somehow, they won. Against all odds, the Crusaders routed Kerboga's army. The city was saved. The impossible had happened. But at what cost? The final road to Jerusalem, madness and massacre. By the time Tancred and his men reached Jerusalem, they were no longer an army. They were shadows of men. They had starved in Anatolia. They had bled at Antioch. They had seen horrors that no knight was meant to see. But they had not come this far to fail. On July 15th, 1099, the Crusaders stormed the city. What followed was not a battle, but a bloodbath. The streets of Jerusalem became rivers of death. Knights rode through ankle-deep blood, cutting down civilians as priests chanted hymns of victory. Muslim and Jewish defenders were burned alive in their places of worship. Even Crusaders were sickened by the scale of the slaughter. Tancred at last tried to stop the killing, He offered protection to those who sought refuge in the Al-Aqsa Mosque, but his mercy meant nothing. Other crusaders arrived hours later and killed every last person inside. Tancred had drawn a line, and it had been erased in blood. For the first time, he questioned everything. Was this truly the will of God, or had they all been deceived? Tancred the ruler, a throne of sand. Jerusalem had been taken. The Holy Land had been conquered. But war does not end with victory. It only changes. Tancred did not return home. He had no home to return to. Instead, he claimed Galilee, ruling as prince under Baldwin Thus, the new king of Jerusalem. But even among fellow crusaders, there was no peace. Bohemond, his uncle and mentor, was captured by the Turks, leaving Antioch vulnerable. Tancred seized control of the city in his absence, refusing to give it up, even when Bohemond was freed. Meanwhile, his rival Raymond of Toulouse sought power in Tripoli, leading to violent clashes. The Crusaders had once fought for God. Now, they fought each other. For over a decade, Tancred ruled with an iron fist, leading campaigns against Muslims, Byzantines, and even fellow Christians. He refused to bend to anyone. Antioch was his. Galilee was his. But the lands he fought for were like sand, slipping through his fingers. And then, his body betrayed him. The end of a warrior, 1112. Death without glory. In December 1112, Tancred fell gravely ill. Some say it was typhoid fever, a plague that swept through the Crusader states. Others believe it was an infection from his countless wounds, finally rotting him from the inside out. There was no glorious battle, no final charge, no heroic last stand. He died in a bed, fevered and broken, far from the battlefield. And as he stared at the ceiling of his tent, did he wonder if it had all been worth it? He had won battles, he had carved out a kingdom, but he had never ruled as a king. And after his death, the lands he fought for fell into the hands of others. Antioch, Galilee, and Jerusalem would all eventually be lost. The Crusader states would crumble. And Tancred of Hauteville? He became another forgotten name in history. Tancred fought for something greater than himself. But in the end, what did he really leave behind? No dynasty, no empire, no lasting rule. Only his name, written in the blood of his enemies. He was a knight who never stopped fighting, even when there was nothing left to fight for. Perhaps that is why he remains a legend, not because he won, but because he never knew how to stop. If you've watched until the end, thank you. You already know. History isn't just about the past. It's about the men who lived it, fought it, and were consumed by it. If you want more stories like this, forgotten warriors, untold histories, and the darker truths of our past, then make sure to subscribe, leave a comment, and share your thoughts.